Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our SunoikisisDC digital cultural heritage session for today. My name is Chiara Palladino and I'm co-running this term's series of Sunoikis sessions with Gabby Bodard at the University of London. Welcome everybody. So this is our 8th session for this term. We're going to be talking about ethics, sustainability, and Paradata in 3D heritage. This is one of the numerous sessions that we've had around 3D virtual reconstructions and their implications, particularly for cultural heritage and digital heritage. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. I will just say a couple words about them and then I'll give them the stage so that they can properly introduce themselves. Alicia Walsh at Leiden University and Thomas Flynn, who runs the Special Heritage Review and is a virtual heritage consultant as well. So as usual, Alicia and Tom will make their presentation and you can find the slides and all the materials for the session in the GitHub page. If you would like to ask questions as they talk and as you see the slides, there is a comment section that you can use if you're following us live via YouTube. We're going to be able to see your comments and we will address them at the end of the session. If you're not following us live and you're just rewatching this on the recording from YouTube, welcome anyway. It's a pleasure to have you. And you can post your questions afterwards in the GitHub page, in the issues, and we hope that everything will be accessible to you as well. So without further ado, I think I shall leave the stage to Alicia, who is going to introduce the session and run the first part.
Yes, thank you, Chiara, and thank you both to you and Gabby for organizing this session and for inviting us to speak. Yeah, I think both Tom and I maybe have been part of Sunoikis in the past, but it's nice to join again and share the new things that we've been working on and related to this topic. Yeah, so as mentioned, my name is Alicia Walsh. I'm a PhD researcher at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And I'm going to share a bit about my ongoing research in the ethics of 3D being used in Dutch archaeology. So just to share a bit of what we'll talk about today, I'll give an intro to ethics, sustainability, and Paradata, and about how we are applying the FAIR and CARE principles, particularly with 3D methods. And then we'll talk about sustainability, ethics, and Paradata. So we'll each share a couple of case studies about these topics and have a bit of a discussion in between. So in previous lectures, or the previous lecture, you heard about working ethically, responsibly, and collaboratively with Indigenous communities during digital humanities projects. So when we think about ethics of digital heritage and archaeology, working ethically with Indigenous groups is often one of the first things that come to mind. And this is also something that I focused on in the past for my research. But as I've moved forward with my PhD, I've started looking at the way we think about ethics and the ethics of technology when working with cultural material that we would not categorize as Indigenous, or when we can no longer reasonably trace ancestral lineage. So to do that, I want to look at the FAIR and CARE principles, specifically looking at FAIR as an ethical principle and at CARE, not from an Indigenous perspective, although that is why it was created, but as a way to offer nuance to FAIR. So I think you've probably heard about these principles in other sessions, so I won't go into detail again about what they stand for. But basically, FAIR is about making your research available and reusable to others. Which came out of the open access movement. And in many cases, that is what we do want to be striving for. But it's not always appropriate. And that's where CARE can help us. So it can help us in thinking critically about our technology use by considering who are we creating this data for? So other researchers, local communities, or the general public. So as I mentioned, the session is going to cover sustainability, Paradata, and ethics, and I'll share some definitions before we go any further. And I think it's important to note that these three topics don't stand alone, and they can be thought about in connection with each other. So sustainability could mean the archiving of our 3D data to ensure future access and use of it. But it can also mean sustainable practices within our work. So being mindful of our energy use and overall environmental footprint. And then we have Paradata. This is often lumped together with metadata, but I think it's useful to understand the difference between them. So whereas metadata covers the technical information about the data you're creating, such as names, dates, file formats, polygon count, and texture size, Paradata covers the process of creating the data. So how a 3D model was created, why a certain technique was chosen, your rationale, and the workflow steps taken. So in essence, Paradata is the documentation of your 3D work. And this is an important but often overlooked part of the FAIR principles. Your documentation process should be a part of what you're making accessible because it will help enable the reuse of your data. And we have some guidelines on how to achieve this, which I believe Tom will discuss later. And then we have ethics. Very broadly, this is about the moral principles that govern behavior or action. So what is morally right or wrong? But at the same time, ethics is not black or white, and is subject to debate because there's often not a consensus on what is right or wrong due to different cultural and personal values. So there's quite a lot of ethical theories that I could discuss, and I'll touch on another way of thinking about this later on. But one that we could focus on is pragmatic ethics, which evaluates practical consequences and usefulness in specific contexts. So it's about being self-reflective and considering context and historical challenges in our work, but not as a way of policing our discipline. So we do have codes of conduct that are useful because they cover areas that we all mostly agree with. So for instance, the CAA ethics policy with topics such as data stewardship and outreach. But we need to be open to revisiting principles that guide our disciplines because our world and our views within it evolve, as does our technology and the context in which we use them. So ethics can be thought of as best practices for our work, but we should be critical of this based on the context of our work. So if we look at FAIR as an ethical principle, we should break down what is involved in this. And one of the key ethical principles in heritage is to preserve heritage for the future. So if we want to make our 3D data available and reusable, then we need to think about how to make it sustainable with the proper documentation so that it's available for future researchers. And so for the rest of this session, we will provide some case studies on how sustainability, ethics, and Paradata are met in 3D heritage, and what the challenges are and how we might achieve best practices in our discipline. So I'll go straight into this first case study. So for my research, I've been looking at archaeology in the Netherlands and how the digital technologies of 3D and remote sensing are being used, how we're managing this data, and what the ethical considerations are in this context. So archaeology here is very regulated, and there are protocols for archiving data collected during fieldwork, data such as reports, drawings, photographs, and digital maps. And a central national database tracks the metadata for this and is accessible to other researchers, while the digital files are usually held in e-depots. And protocols are outlined in the KNA. This is the Dutch Archaeology Quality Standard, managed by the SIKB, which is the organization that provides standards and registrations for professional archaeologists. However, other collected data, such as 3D data, is not standardized, neither for the collection, analysis, archiving, or sharing of this data. And these standards aren't directly applicable to all archaeologists here, especially if you're working in universities or museums. But the lack of them makes it difficult to know who's using 3D and what is happening to the data. And there's also a lack of knowledge sharing between sectors on these topics. So I created an online survey and have been holding interviews with archaeologists and heritage professionals working in Dutch archaeology. So I can start creating an inventory of who exactly is using these technologies in the field, for what purpose, and how they're managing the data. So that if standards or at least guidelines for best practices can be made, then we have more of a clear picture of the current state of things and how we can handle the data ethically. But as I mentioned before, ethics is very broad and based on societal values. So I also want to see what ethics archaeologists here are concerned with, and if there's enough of a consensus that certain topics can be included into guidelines. So I'm still analyzing the results, but I'll share with you some preliminary data from the survey. So over 100 people from the field answered, all from different sectors, which you can see here. So if I look at the 4 sectors from which most people responded, this was development-led companies, also known as commercial or contract companies, municipal and provincial archaeologists, university researchers, and museum specialists. The most commonly used digital technologies are photogrammetry, aerial drone-based photography, 3D reconstructions, or also known as 3D modeling, and LiDAR. And the main reasons for their use are as documentation methods in the field to either supplement or replace traditional methods such as drawing, and also to help answer research questions, to use in teaching, and for public outreach. And I also asked about the challenges faced when using these technologies, the main ones being the lack of time and money. And especially in fieldwork, efficiency is really key. So you need to move quick because it costs time and money. But this lack of time doesn't always refer to the time that it takes to, say, take photographs in the field for photogrammetry, and then to process process those photos for a 3D model. It's actually usually the time that it takes to create the standard workflow that can be implemented within a company, and for everyone within that company to learn and start using it on a daily basis. And we can see here that the storage of this data is a concern, but it's not one of the top concerns. And I found this interesting, especially because it came up a lot during interviews that I did after this survey, because there's really no consistency over where and how data is stored and how it's being made available in the long term. And of course, this is going to increase as a concern as these techniques become more widely used. So when looking at how data is currently archived and made available, most are being kept on company servers, while only a few are depositing them into e-repositories, which ensure the long-term management of the data. So e-depots such as DANS, the Dutch data archives, actually have guidelines for depositing 3D data here. But most people aren't using this because either it's time consuming to ensure that you're including all the metadata and documentation. And as I said, it's not a requirement for professional archaeologists to archive this particular data. And the other reason is that many people just don't know that it's possible to deposit 3D data here. So 3D models are also being put on online viewers, usually onto Sketchfab. And we know that this can be really helpful for public outreach if that's the purpose of the 3D model. But many are also still treating Sketchfab as a data repository, which we know was not the intended purpose of the site. Sketchfab doesn't ensure sustainability of the data. And as I said, the majority of people are keeping this data on their individual company servers, which are not accessible to people outside of the company unless they request it. But of course, it's hard to know who has what data in this case. It's also unclear what to save and how to save it sustainably. So when using 3D, or when 3D is being used during fieldwork, mostly through photogrammetry, the current main reason is to document profiles and then create an orthophoto from the 3D model. And an orthophoto is a 2D scaled image with distortions from the camera and the terrain removed. And because the main goal here is the single orthophoto, a lot of companies don't feel the need to save the raw data used to produce it. So these would be all the images. And this is a question that we've discussed in the past. Usually we've said it's best practice to save raw data to enable reuse. But the purpose of the 3D model really matters here. Is it really useful to have these photos when all you really want or need is this one singular orthophoto? And what is the benefit of saving all of this and using up all this storage space? And I've discussed this with archaeological depots, who are the ones who receive data from companies post-excavation and handle the archiving of it. And they just don't know yet how to handle 3D data should it come to them. So they are receiving the orthophotos, but some depots want all of the raw photos used to make it, while others do not. So this is a very practical challenge, but it can also be seen as an ethical one. So what do we save? Do we need to save everything for the benefit of future research? So if we start creating standards or protocols for the field, then we need to consider this question and how we should be thinking about it when it comes to 3D models of other types of archaeological features or artifacts. Because on the other side of sustainability, although related, is our environmental impact. When discussing what ethics archaeologists are concerned with, the environment came up quite often. When we talk about archiving all this data and deciding what to save, we should consider not only how practical it is for reuse, but also the environmental cost of storage. So how much data contributes to our energy use and the carbon footprint, and which raw data is worth saving when it is contributing to this. So most have agreed that 3D data is currently not sustainable when it's on some storage somewhere and when there's no minimum quality standards in terms of resolution or metadata or documentation of the creation of the data, so the paradata. Then it's really difficult to reuse this data, and you can't compare interpretations. However, there are also people who are against the creation of standards, and they note it's because they can tend to block development and cause people to stop thinking critically about outcomes. And this is really a key point. We need to be thinking critically about the digital tools we're using and how they're being applied, and whether or not standards actually come about. I'm hoping that this research will increase the discussion on how we should be thinking critically, and how there may be many different perspectives on how we can responsibly carry out digital archaeological practices. So I will hand it over to Tom now for his case study.
Cool, thank you, Alicia. I'm just gonna zip through those slides there. Oh, and get to my words. Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Flynn. I'm a digital heritage consultant in the UK. I've been working with heritage organisations, technology companies, and academia for about 10 years now, maybe a bit more. I began working with 3D while at the British Museum, went on to co-found something called Museum in a Box for a good 6.5 years. I was cultural heritage lead at Sketchfab, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a few slides. And have authored a few papers on the subjects of AI, 3D, open access, copyright, and all manner of things, because I mean, as I think we're seeing in this and probably throughout the whole course, is that digital heritage touches on many different areas and interacts with many different disciplines. I'm going to be talking a bit about a project I'm working on at the moment in partnership with Wikimedia UK and funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, called UK Heritage 3D Data at Risk, which actually concerns Sketchfab specifically. So just to take the theme of sustainability, then I just want to consider over the last 15 or so years how, and I'll be talking in general terms mostly about what's happened in the UK, but I think you'll see through the slides that I share about a survey that I've been doing that it mirrors a lot of the findings that Alicia has been uncovering as well. But if we go back to 2010 and consider how the heritage sector in general is discovering that 3D digitization is more accessible, usable and affordable, with the release of certain tools, such as Metashape. Photoscan was released in the 2010s. Autodesk had a lot of online tools available then. So people are experimenting and looking for ways to engage audiences with their collections, with new technology and 3D capture, specifically photogrammetry, but also other methods, is being investigated. In 2011, sketchfab.com launches as the YouTube for 3D. So if that should paint a picture of kind of the aspirations of the site as a place for user-generated content and community around a particular media, in this case 3D. Skip forward to 2015 and Sketchfab begins to offer free and discounted account subscriptions to cultural heritage organizations as part of a program that I ran actually for a long time. Skip forward again, and I'm glossing over a lot of things here, but in 2021, Sketchfab was acquired by Epic Games, and in 2023, Sketchfab and Epic announced planned changes to the services and migration to another platform called fab.com, which is more marketplace oriented. And this raised concerns within the heritage sector and digital artist circles regarding the access to the data itself, and possibly if you're using it as a repository, the data itself being at risk. So in 2025, or a little bit before that, maybe 2024, I began looking at kind of this issue in particular from a UK perspective, and we launched the UK 3D Heritage Data at Risk project last November. So the problem is that many UK, well, in the context of the project, many UK heritage organisations rely on Sketchfab for publishing, sharing, and storytelling, scientific communication, and as Alicia says, some even use it as a repository for their data, or maybe even as a backup. And while I believe Sketchfab is a really wonderful product, and it's definitely a tool within the many ways that heritage projects can engage folks with their 3D data outputs, it's become the de facto, it's become kind of the one that everyone uses, and changes that are being made to the platform highlight a lack of alternatives, as well as a variance between priorities between the heritage sector and a commercial platform like Sketchfab. So to begin with, I identified 230 UK heritage users on Sketchfab, and I've written organizations there, but in fact it also includes individuals such as researchers, scientists, enthusiast 3D scanners who are all creating cultural heritage 3D data. These data producers have uploaded some 11,000 3D models to Sketchfab, and in the process they've garnered some 63,000 followers. So there's another component of the audience and the social aspect of the platform as well as the data and what people are doing in terms of publishing it online. So that's kind of the background. There's some concern and an identified need for something like Sketchfab, which is almost, before the project even begins, it's clear that folks want to be publishing data in a certain way, which suggests that there's maybe an opportunity to find alternatives or develop alternatives. I'll skip this slide because I've just kind of said this. But again, the problem isn't specific to Sketchfab. Any third-party or commercial platform can carry similar risks. So why do people use Sketchfab then, and how does it help achieve findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data? Well, it's a heavily search engine optimized website with great user experience features, being able to search, tag content, find content, follow creators, bookmark, like, create collections. So the data that's on Sketchfab is very findable. It's very accessible in other ways as well, accessible in the sense that you can get at the data or the experience in many different ways. The platform does a lot of clever stuff behind the scenes, optimizing 3D data for delivery on the web. It's no good really having some 3D files can be incredibly huge. If you just plonk that on a server online, not many people will be able to interact with that data unless they're have specialized equipment. So there's a divergence there of expert audiences versus non-expert audiences, which maybe a platform like Sketchfab serves both sides. There are web standards, it's a web standards-based platform. The 3D viewer runs on WebGL, so it any operating system, any web browser on any machine, and it has, again, great user interface. It's just incredibly easy to use as a platform, and that's incredibly important for anyone working with data or showing that data to audiences. Interoperability is served by automatically converting, or rather ingesting, actually, almost all major 3D file formats, and automatically converting those formats into modern standards such as GLTF and USD and other formats. And that's important because I think if we talk about the perfect long-term data archive, we can consider, well, what goes into that archive, what file format. And traditionally, I think, as I don't think I've got a slide about it, but most organizations will be using the OBJ 3D file format with image files attached. And in another 50 years, is that still going to be supported? Is it a process of constantly updating and renewing data, converting it into new formats? That's the essence of interoperability, as well as being able to then open and access that data in different ways. So the platform of Sketchfab allows 3D data and the 3D viewer to be accessed and customized via application programming interfaces. So not just through the website interface. And the data is reusable. You can embed the 3D viewer in different contexts on the web. There's a download feature, and then open, free, and paid license framework. So it's I've written free TM because free to use, but the saying goes that if it's free, then you are the product that is being kind of sold, in the sense that the priorities for any commercial company will be increasing revenue, increasing users, making sales. So when it's free, there are other priorities at play. Again, easy to use, provides access to new audiences. Sketchfab has a huge creator audience, people that want to download content and reuse it, not from academia necessarily, not from the cultural heritage sector. And you can also publish your data alongside peers. So you can search for similar data between different projects and organizations. That was a bit of a ramble, so I hope that kind of made sense. But I think Sketchfab really does help in a lot of ways in achieving fair principles. The questions that I'm kind of trying to answer through the research project is, how and what, and again, maybe sounds very similar to what Alicia is doing with her project, is how and why are UK organizations creating 3D data? What needs does Sketchfab meet or not meet with regards to the goals? What alternatives are available today? Or maybe even, there's another way to phrase that, is what are the workflows that are available? What other platforms are available for folks to invest in? And is there a need for some kind of new UK heritage-focused 3D data service or platform to serve these needs? So as I said, a lot of organizations have been identified. I've been reaching out to them, some survey responses, and quite a few interviews and some online events to look into these questions. The kind of organizations that I'm speaking to, or rather that have responded, mostly museums, but then a long tail of very varied types of organizations. And this feeds into many very varied methods of producing 3D and reasons for producing 3D goals with their outputs. So everything from archive libraries on down to archaeological institutes, community groups, educational groups. And in terms of size, there are, a few national organizations. And so remember, these are all drawn from, mostly drawn from users of Sketchfab in the first place. So national organizations, regional, but a large portion are local authority and university cultural heritage organizations. And that means that the cultural heritage project or the digitizing process sits within or often sits within the constraints or infrastructure of a local authority. So whether that's a council in the UK or within a university, and that can dictate a lot of how data is managed, governed, stored, because there's no particular, for example, budget or no particular infrastructure for the heritage project. I'm afraid my data is not as well cleaned as Alicia's. I need to get through and tidy things up a bit. Main goals for publishing data. The most common case is online engagement, and that would make sense, but also for exhibitions and display. So we're talking about on-site experiences. So we're reaching online audiences, on-site audiences, education and outreach, and then in fourth place, research, academic study. These are the reasons why folks are publishing data online. What types of resources, if any, limit the ability to engage or expand in high quality 3D data management? And as you'll kind of be seeing, that they're reflecting similar findings to Alicia's again: insufficient time, insufficient funding, lack of specialized technical equipment, undefined workflows or standards. This, I think, would be common across almost every country who's has a well-developed digital heritage community or practice would be similar to this, is my guess. And then I was asking that there are more questions in the survey, but I pulled out the ones that I feel are pertinent to this session. Asking if organizations have a formal digital preservation policy that covers 3D data types. The majority for the majority of organizations, the answer is no, or it's even unknown. So maybe slightly worrying. This question touches on privacy. So addressing privacy within digitization, the idea of de-identification and cleaning data before publication. Again, the answer is mostly no. There's no formal protocol for that. With regards to sustainable data practice, so this is sustainability in the sense of environmental impact, reducing the amount of energy consumed by the workflow of digitization through to publication. Majority do not have use a particular or follow particular guidance in the process. File optimization is the second most common, simply just reducing file size to publish online. So a side effect of that is that it would use up less energy, I think. And how does your organization approach indigenous data sovereignty regarding 3D data? Again, the majority do not have a policy, and this in part will be because of the kind of collections that organizations hold, but regardless, not having a policy in place prevents kind of engaging with other types of subject in the digitization process. So another opportunity or another gap identified there. I'll stop there. I hope that's given everyone a bit to think about, and pass back over to Alicia.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Tom. So we've been talking about sustainability of 3D data and how this can be considered sort of an ethical principle. And what I found in my research is that most people agree that we should be considering this. I think that's also kind of highlighted in Tom's presentation. You know, most people want to be publishing data and doing something with it. And I think this is because this is still a relatively practical way to be critically looking at our 3D use. But there are other ethics to consider. So we know that ethics can be dependent on context of societal values, history, and colonial legacies, personal values of the researcher, and the communities with which we are working or are working in. So 3D methods being used in one country may have different ethical considerations to another, but also within countries. So we can't assume that there are single societal norms and values within one place when there are many cultures and subcultures that make up a country. Go backwards. And I can tell you that when I first introduced this topic to archaeologists here in the EU part of the Netherlands, I say the EU part because the Netherlands is a kingdom that it also encompasses islands in the Caribbean. There's usually a slight level of confusion on how this relates to 3D, or statements that ethics isn't really a concern. And like I mentioned already, it's usually because this is thought about in colonial context. And although the Netherlands does have quite a history of colonizing, I suppose we aren't confronted with this every day when doing fieldwork here. Of course, when you're working in a museum setting with colonial collections, or if you're a university researcher working abroad, this would come up more, and this is reflected in the survey data. So I'm trying to make ethics as a topic more digestible to people and easier to understand in what ways we're actually dealing with ethical topics, and kind of move away from the idea that ethics only concerns those working with Indigenous groups or with colonial collections. And to do that, I found this paper from 2018 really helpful because the author categorizes ethics into three main elements: practical, philosophical, and political. So practical ethics is about the rules that we follow in our professions, the do's and don'ts found in codes of conduct, which is a really useful way of approaching ethics because they're usually written down and everyone more or less agrees with them. Philosophical ethics, on the other hand, are more ones that often have no clear answer between right and wrong, and are based more on the existential meaning of the past and our relationship to it. And this can be really dependent on our own personal and societal values. So we can think, for example, here about how we feel about the rights of the dead and exhibiting human remains. And political ethics deals more with power imbalances, systems of authority, and social justice. So situations in which groups of people control a narrative which impact another group of people. And the author also notes that nearly all ethical debates can be framed as political, since we are working in specific socio-political contexts, and there are usually power asymmetries between researchers and non-researchers. So what does all this have to do with 3D and its use during fieldwork? So this framework, I think, is really useful for categorizing the ethics of 3D. So how we look at human remains, as an example, as I mentioned, this can be a philosophical ethic because how you feel about excavating them and putting them on display in a museum will have a lot to do with your own values and those of your family, your community, or your spirituality. But we also have codes of conduct for handling human remains. So this can also be categorized as a practical ethic. So we're already starting to see some overlap between these categories. But human remains, or the treatment of human remains, can become even more nuanced when we create a 3D model of them. So should we be putting them online and making them downloadable? What is the benefit of this and what are the risks? So there's a paper in 2021 called 3D Dead. It provides some points for consideration, such as the creation, sharing, and printing of human remains should only be used for research, teaching, and outreach, but not for profit or advertising. They also say that scanning and sharing should be discussed and agreed upon with descendants, if there are any, And researchers should think about ways to mitigate potential reuse or misuse of the data. And metadata should always be accompanied with a 3D model. So I asked this question amongst archaeologists here, and there was some difference in perspective. Some said that you should never put these online, or if we do and there is no educational or, if we do and there's an educational or scientific purpose, the public doesn't necessarily need access to it. Meanwhile, others have no problem with it, especially if there are no living descendants of these remains. However, most agree that this is really dependent on context. So where are these remains from? How old are they? What is the reason for making a 3D model of them in the first place? And here is where the CARE principles can help us think responsibly. So who are we making this data for? What are other potential users of this data that we're not considering? And what are the potential misuses? And similar research from Portugal and the UK also show that the majority of people support the sharing of 3D models of human remains online, but for educational and research purposes. And there was a really nice recent article in 2025 by a researcher in the UK, which discusses the sharing of content on the archaeology data service and the ethical considerations for this, such as providing content warnings for people who may be uncomfortable coming across these types of media. So human remains are one example of 3D ethics, but I've been collecting other considerations that are important to archaeologists or ones that they have encountered in their work. And this is, of course, ongoing research, but what I would like to do is categorize them within the 3 key elements to help with their understanding and see where the overlaps are and what could be more easily included into codes of conduct. Different sector policies. So, for example, environmental sustainability may be considered all 3 of course, this is a political topic, but guidelines could be added into codes of conduct on how to offset our carbon footprint. However, how we address this may be very different on the context of the material and where we are working. And other ethics identified also include being transparent about your results and the limitations of the technology that you're using. Also being aware that there are a variety of perspectives and values within a society that should be reflected on and how your methods may impact them. And I think that's over to Tom now.
Thank you again, Alicia. I'm really enjoying this session. It's kind of ethics is something that I don't have a background in, so this has been an education for me as well. And this next slide that you can see is simply pulled just from a recent workshop that I was at in Arizona in the US with developers, so web developers and platform providers for archaeological and cultural heritage data, so repositories, and as well as academics and cultural heritage practitioners and Native American, some representatives from Native American tribes, a workshop on similar topics. So just if it hasn't become clear already, that the issues that we're talking about in this session are being looked at all over the world in terms of how folks are addressing, with in particular, 3D data and ethical considerations, privacy considerations, transparency. It's something that everyone's grappling with, not just with future production of 3D data, but the fact that there is a volume of 3D data that has been produced under varying circumstances, and how can that be treated with respect and care, considering it already exists. The workshop was considering potential updates to the digital archaeological record, which is a platform hosted by Arizona State University and comparable to the UK's Archaeological Data Service, and maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe the DANS service in the Netherlands as well. So that it's a repository for research data, and is accredited with the Core Trust Seal, I believe, which is a particular accreditation for platforms that can promise that data will remain available for the long term. And everything we were discussing on this in this session came up and more during this workshop as well. It was a few days at the university, and some issues were raised were a need for clear representations by data producers or collectors addressing the care principles during data and upload to a repository platform. So just as a couple of examples, the idea that data has been produced as part of a project, but when it's being made available either to expert or non-expert audiences, there needs to be a representation of permission, and authority. So for example, I have permission to upload this data. It was obtained in this manner, and this maybe sounds hopefully a bit like the metadata and paradata that we were talking about earlier, or acknowledging that there are known obstructions to publishing a certain kind of data, or maybe there are conditions for publishing this data online, but that being part of the platform or service process, the workflow that should be put in place. There were discussions around the friction that this can cause when it can actually make it more difficult for people to make their data fair by requiring adherence to, or at least consideration of, care principles. So there's something that needs to be done there in terms of making it easy, but also making it a valid process and not just care washing. I just made that up, but the idea that it actually is significant in how folks are adding metadata to a subject as they make it available online. Also, it was identified that there is a need for granular permissions for everything from access, licensing, and labeling of data when it's put online. So this is, we're talking about 3D data, but it could be any kind of data. So it may be culturally sensitive data, the use of warning messages to, only see content when you explicitly want to, perhaps authentication processes. And this one thing that came up was between the two represented tribes at the workshop, they had very different approaches to what could or could not be shared online with regards to human remains and funerary goods. And they weren't the same across the tribes, and this will be true across any other groups, I'm sure, across the world, that there is a need for granular record of permissions in the metadata and paradata, but also on the other side, when you're talking about publishing and showing people data, what does that look like? And we did a bit of considering some visual prototyping. What does a web page look like? What buttons, what flags, what reporting mechanisms need to be put in place or would be useful? So, for example, mechanisms for challenging the misuse of content and how to open dialogues between communities who maybe are the cultural owners of content and the organizations or people capturing that content in 3D and publishing as part of research. So for copyrighted content, and this is US focused, it's only really a valid process for companies in the United States. There's something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which outlines a process for challenging on copyright grounds the availability of content online. It basically requires some information to make the request to take down the content, and an agreement with a publishing platform to respond to such a takedown request, remove the content, and put them in contact with the publishing party. But there is no similar process for online content for challenging on perhaps ethical grounds. So there may be an opportunity there, even if it's not legally binding, but a process to approach these issues and make conversations about the content that's been produced, as we say, in many different ways, and maybe some considerations weren't undertaken during the data production. And this comes back to the power dynamic of publishing, or rather managing collections, holding collections. Who decides if a challenge is valid or not? These are open questions. What this, I'll keep going. What this suggests to me is going back to the idea of metadata and paradata. As I said, the data itself as a 3D model has less meaning than the data within the context of what it is and who's made it and how it was made, and it helps us to understand the quality and the value. And again, this is this idea of transparency with a production process. So I always say that there's not really there's best practice and there's an ideal for metadata and paradata, but in terms of publishing data, if you are transparent, you can make it clear, as I say, the quality or the value of the data, and it can still have quality or value, but on a varying scale. There's not everything is going to be perfect. And why is this useful? This idea of kind of well-documented data. So this is a slide I've shown for a while now, and for me, and in the work that I do, I see. We're going to read from bottom to top here that well-documented and archived high-quality 3D data sets underpin or can underpin accessible libraries of openly licensed and interoperable 3D data. So we're deriving from high-resolution, perhaps high-quality data sets, derivative libraries that are intended for reuse. Based on the considerations that we've been discussing as well. Maybe they're not made openly available. Maybe they're only made viewable, for example. But this can still power engaging and delightful and educational 3D experiences for audiences. So that's how I see these things. But it all starts from that well-documented and archived high-quality data, so people know what they're looking at, and it's not just a pretty piece of 3D. For example, just by way of a quick example, using Sketchfab, we can search on Sketchfab for ancient Greek pottery, vases, amphorae, and maybe on the one hand they look very, very similar, but we have two similar looking subjects from two different organizations, and if we use some of the tools on Sketchfab, we can see that they're actually two very different resolutions. If you look at the texturing, you might be able to see, hopefully on the stream, that there is slight variations in the material properties as they're rendered, also in the resolution of the textures, and this is just two subjects pulled pretty much at random from the selection, and across different organizations you'll see a huge variation. So not being able to understand how something was made makes it tricky, I think, for us to then compare and make use of all this wonderful data, often open access data available for download and reuse. If we don't know what that data is, it limits the kinds of reuse that we can use it for, whether that's around academic research or through to education and non-expert contexts as well. If we've been talking about metadata and paradata and you're not so familiar, and these are, I think, malleable terms. Different people will interpret them differently, but metadata being metadata about the data, so it could be descriptive, explaining what something is, how it was created, what time, or rather what period it was created, when it was discovered, or accessioned to a particular museum. So this is a separate file. It's good to think of it in this way, that you have a 3D model and a separate file that explains everything. I'm just looking at, we've got only a few minutes left, so I might skip through a bit, but it's also technical data, the file format, the the polygon count, the texture resolution, etc. And some of this will be in the file itself. And then Paradata is data about the process, as we said. So how the data was captured, processing softwares, and the subjective decisions that were made throughout the process. So that's also a very important part, is folks describing why they've done things as opposed to other things during a particular workflow. And you can check these in the slide deck as well, as I won't stick around too much. So there's lots of standards and guidelines and even more available, but this is only, these only become true standards when lots of people begin using them, and we're definitely not at a state now across, well, in the UK, definitely, or across the globe, where it's possible to compare like for 3D data in general. There's an ideal, as I say. There's been lots of literature written on the topic, but as we saw in Alicia's slides as well, Paradata in practice is a different matter when people don't have time or money to undertake best practice. It doesn't, it's not output as part of the process. So again, from my survey, most folks are, or 50% are not currently recording Paradata as part of their digitization processes. So there's an opportunity there, some idea of the bare minimum or good, better, best guidance, a very practical guidance, step-by-step guidance. There are, opportunities for tools and services that take people through the process. So for example, the Digital Lab Notebook by Cultural Heritage Imaging, maybe there's some help that AI can do to make it easy to improve data sets by attaching, sorting, aligning metadata as well. I'll stop there, and for the practical exercise, maybe Gabby, are we passing over to you here? Or I'm happy to as well.
Well, I think, you first drafted it. I think, I'm happy. We can all chip in and talk about it. If you want to give your initial sense of what it was about, and we can maybe add some sort of more practical notes.
Sure. Happy
those of us who are student facing in the follow up to this.
Yeah. Okay then. Well, so the practical exercise, as I said, there's a whole huge amount of 3D data that exists online already. So what we've done here is listed just a few of the data repositories or published data sets available from Sketchfab through to European. Open Heritage 3D is a global repository out of University of Southern California, and a couple of not-for-profits at the bottom. And the exercise is to compare similar 3D models. This might be tricky, but compare 3D model listings from these online platforms and review the available contextual information, so that metadata and paradata, to see if it's clear how that data was captured, collected, or created, maybe even why. What legal and ethical considerations are relevant to the subject? Are they made clear in the listing? Is there any way of looking into these topics and themes? Is there an indication of how long the resource will be available on that particular URL? And how well optimized is the 3D asset? Is it only viewable? Is it a 2D image of the 3D dataset? Is it downloadable? And how large are those files? How much energy are they consuming sitting on a server somewhere? And then consider, finally, what would be the best case scenario for documentation to submit as an archival 3D data package and a publication data package. And inherent in both of those subsets is the idea of the audience. Who is the data package for? And so you'll need to consider that as well. So what's the best case for a particular, a given audience, expert, non-expert, academic, school child, you decide.
I suppose another way of thinking about this exercise that might be interesting would be to start from the last question. What do you think would be the best case scenario? After having had the discussion that we've had over the last hour, and there's also some readings suggested in the session page, of which for my students at least 2 of them are required readings, but other people may choose to look at those readings and various other things. And having talked about all that and reviewing the slides, think about if you had a really good archival 3D data package, what metadata and paradata would it include? Come up with your own sense of what that should be. Maybe find a 3D model somewhere online, but don't look at its metadata or paradata and think, what should it have? What would be the maximal list it would have? On the understanding that nothing has the maximal list. Nothing is perfect yet. Then go and look at the thing and see what's there that you hadn't thought of, and see what isn't there that you might have expected to see, and see if you can figure out why. Or what might be there, but it's not telling you whether it's there or not. If there's not actually data about the data telling you how to find the data, right? I mean, that's the prime example of missing metadata. But yeah, I don't know if doing the exercise backwards is an interesting exercise or not. But.
Yeah, during the workshop in Arizona, we talked about platforms even offering some kind of rating system themselves for data as it is being submitted, and possibly even making that visible on, it's a bit of a, it might put people off publishing data if there's a big red light that says this data meets only 1 out of 50 criteria for best practice. But there's got to be a balance, I think, between encouraging folks to do their best and shaming them into doing their best.
Yeah. I've just put on the screen there the link to the session page, which has a copy of this exercise on it, and also where you can download the slides and those readings that I talked about. That's also linked in the description underneath this video, as you can't click on the version that's on the screen there. And apologies, it's hiding half of Chiara's face.
Just going off of what Tom just said about kind of a rating system, I thought that was really interesting. And I did some previous work with the Pure 3D project listed here, and we looked into the peer review of 3D scholarship or 3D publishing. So kind of, thinking about 3D models not so much as a standalone thing, but like an entire publication that can be peer reviewed by academics for academic purposes. And then, you can read these open reviews and kind of see, it kind of contributes to the value of the 3D, I think, but also helps the researcher when they want to reuse that and they know what they're getting, kind of. That makes sense. Yeah. We should have a paper coming out about this soon. It's in press.
Great.
I think this would be a very good moment for us to invite questions in the chat. If the people who are following us live have any questions or curiosities for our speakers, I feel like this would be a great topic of conversation.
Meanwhile, I had a question for Tom, if that's okay. Did you, in your survey, look into, because you mentioned like you looked into the goals of producing and publishing 3D, but did you ask about if people are reusing 3D models and for what purposes? Or was it mostly about them as creators of the models? Oh, you're muted.
It was mostly about them as creators and stewards of data. But there was one question about how they track, analytics with regards to the data. So it's not so much about why the data was downloaded, but if you would use, for example, Sketchfab's download count or view count, but most weren't tracking anything really, and that says something about the available tools, but you can't really do anything if you don't have the data, or it can't inform practice, I suppose. I know that different platforms approach that differently. Maybe you're familiar with MorphoSource as a repository, and the process of downloading data there can include a modal pop-up that says, why do you want this data? And that's a great way of collecting information. But is that also, going back to the idea of friction, does it slow down? For some people, it might put them off downloading and reusing that data anyway. Or is it, a very positive check on the speed at which something's downloaded?
That's cool. I actually didn't know that about MorphoSource, that they had that option, because I always think about it with Sketchfab, and yeah, you have these models on there and then you could have hundreds of downloads, but you don't know what people are doing with these models. And I would love to know, and also for kind of thinking about uses and misuses of 3D, like we kind of can guess in what ways 3D models can be misused, but I don't think we have all the data to prove that. But then on the other hand, I guess if you had the option for somebody to say, like, I'm going to use this model in this terrible way, I don't think they would say it, but I think it's an interesting question.
Just again, a single sort of data point. There may also be an issue in terms of the questionnaire, with people not having entirely thought through the questions. I filled in your questionnaire recently, Tom, for the Institute of Classical Studies Ehrenberg collection, and I put that we don't have any analytics, but I do always check our download count on Sketchfab all the time. I didn't think of that as analytics. So I suspect that's not reflected in the data.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's lots of gaps in how folks interpret data. I think, just anecdotally from my experience at Sketchfab, I did keep a log of the reuse of not just cultural heritage data, but whenever I saw a 3D model that I was aware of on Sketchfab being reused in a context, I would drop it into a forum thread. Unfortunately, the forum's been closed down now, but the majority was very positive reuse of all kinds of data. And I think it's important always to consider that once something is online, so whether that's the 3D data itself, whether that's made downloadable or not, whether it's the 2D image or a video of that data, you have given up control completely to what happens to that data. Even if somebody fills in a form and says, I will use this for X purposes, you have zero control over that. And that's important to recognize in the process, and to weigh up the risk versus benefit to publishing anything online. We're all sitting here with our faces online, so there's a risk and a benefit to putting your own likeness online. Similarly for any data as well, I think. But the majority, I think, of people are pretty normal and pretty respectful, and should one or two bad actors who will do bad things with data anyway prevent other positive interactions with content.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder for us. I also liked the term care washing that you said.
Yeah, that just came to me as I was
that was a good one.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I want to sing that to the tune of Car Wash. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just not the human element in all of these processes. I think of the creation of 3D data. It begins with a person. That person's operating within an organization, probably under a project with certain funding. Everything's done for a reason within a certain country with certain laws. Everything's done for a reason, and how that data is represented can be influenced by what's the word I'm looking for? We have all these wonderful papers enlightening us on the benefits of good paradata and metadata, but on the other side, maybe folks will, say whatever needs to be said to be able to publish their data and be recognized under certain ways. I suppose this is just a amusing, rambling thought there. I mean, for me, I think hearing all of the responses to your survey this year and hearing what the folks in the US had, it's great and also worrying to know that everyone's got the same sort of problems. And for the project that I'm doing, I'm trying to couch, or rather think of, some amazingly wonderful platform and workflows that could exist in the future. People could be publishing data regularly and in the best possible way. How to think of that, as I said, like as an individual practitioner, as an organization, maybe also within that, that's small organizations versus national organizations. The resources are so different. And how does that help? If you do well at an individual level, that influences how the organization is represented and the data that organization represents. That goes up to the sort of regional and national levels. And if it's all done well, maybe at the national level, then you can start engaging with other national collections of data. And I think that's what the European Cultural Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage is aspiring to. But I suspect there's a lot of unpicking of data and massaging of data that will need to be done at every stage from the bottom up to get things to align and make it searchable and usable, comparable.
We have a question by Sarah in the chat, specifically again about the term care washing. So I'll show it here. Yes. So care washing is an excellent term. Do you think it does happen? Ooh.
Yeah, I was wondering, do we want to come up with a real example of that or a hypothetical example to avoid shaming anyone? But
well, I think maybe it's not quite the same thing, but I think anybody who uploads a 3D model to sketchfab.com, they represent that they are the owner of that data, just by dint of it being published under your profile and the user agreement that you may or may not read when you sign up to the platform. So that in itself, is probably how a lot of. But I can't think of a particular example, but I would imagine that, for better or worse, maybe on purpose, maybe on accident, folks will say, I have permission to publish X or Y, when in fact maybe they're making assumptions about the authority to control. They haven't taken the time to make the proper considerations. That's my guess. I don't know.
I think this happens, also not going to name names, but when you have objects of cultural heritage held in museums, that there are repatriation requests to have that object back, and then the object gets 3D scanned and put onto Sketchfab. Was there any consultation with the community about this? And did they want a 3D model made accessible? It goes into like the ownership of data and all these questions that I think we've talked about in other sessions in the past few years, but maybe that's another example.
it's the release of the eventual release of a 3D model of the Nefertiti bust. An example of that, where they, having been shamed into do so by someone releasing a pirated version of it, they released a version with embedded in the 3D model. If you print it, there is incised into the base of the model. It says, this is copyright the museum. When that is a very significant question as to whether there's any reasonable legal or ethical way they could claim copyright on a 3D model of piece of heritage that some people are trying to repatriate and so forth.
Interestingly, another person who was at the event in Arizona was from the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, and we talked a little bit about that exact circumstance, but also within the context of people coming and making 3D scans of tombs. And in a sense, I feel like ancient Egyptian culture has become fairly ubiquitous to the point where people don't think of it as belonging to anyone, because it's been in movies, in books, and and this goes probably way back to the Victorian times, the colonial times, when folks were kind of treating it exactly that same way, and we can see that going through. And we had a chat, the fellow from the Ministry of Antiquities, around, well, what can we do about that? How do you challenge a 3D model of a pyramid? And so we're not talking also about just experts and academics. The technology is so easy to use now that people will be going on holiday and making 3D scans of things as a holiday snap, but in 3D, and publishing it. And it's maybe what's the term, that the horse is already bolted. No, that's not right. It's less stable. And it's already kind of happening. And so the question is, again, that question of, well, how can we slow things down and review them, and maybe if a representative from a government is having those issues, consider how a small community with much less power would go about anything like that.
Yeah, it's as you say, we can't necessarily control how people use our data, or even our images that are easily able to capture data from while walking past them. Even putting something up with a Creative Commons license doesn't guarantee that people will give attribution, that people will only use in a share-alike way, etc. It means they legally ought to, but in Egypt and in a few other places, all Egyptian ancient heritage is copyright of the state, which wouldn't be the case here, but it's the case there, and that doesn't stop people doing it. So I'm sure it it is able to be used to stop some people doing it, but yeah, it's pretty hard to control as the technology gets so much easier to use, as you say. I guess what we can do about it, in terms of us as the actual people here and our students and colleagues, is we can make sure we're using data ethically. So if I have some 3D imagery of something which I feel it's not entirely ethical that it was created, I'm not going to reuse it. I'm not going to publish it. I'm not going to circulate it as part of a student exercise. That's one thing I suppose we can do. Is that too little, too late? I don't know.
My dad has a saying, you just put your brick in the wall. You do your part, and as you say, what you can. Some experience from Sketchfab when I was chasing up folks that had reused an artist's 3D model without giving them proper attribution was frequently I'd find that people just didn't understand licensing or attribution. It wasn't malicious. It was just the fact that they were ignorant of how things worked. And I'm sure that covers a lot of things, but maybe there's less of an excuse when you come from an academic or a cultural heritage background or in that authority. I think there's a duty of care that should be undertaken whenever you're doing anything really. And hands up, this is not something that I was doing when I was at the British Museum, making 3D scans of things, because it was all new to me, and I was much younger and I hadn't thought of this. But it's not really an excuse, but the data exists still, and then there are layers to work through there. It's the person who made the data, it's the organization who holds the object, and whether whoever holds the reins of the data now is willing to facilitate a conversation or a process that upholds best practice.
Yeah, I think it's also worth remembering that one of the very first things that Alicia said an hour ago, that with these sort of care principles and these sorts of ethical considerations that we're having, and that we can go into a bit of detail. We're not making laws here, right? We're not saying if you do this you will be damned. We're saying just be thoughtful about how you do it. Be mindful about these things, and if you're going to use some online data that you think is slightly ethically questionable, consider the costs and benefits of that, and and everybody has to make their own decision on that. And we can have codes of conduct, and we can judge other people if they make decisions we think are harmful, but we're not making laws. No one can put me in prison for 3D printing the bust of Nefertiti, luckily.
Well, now they've got evidence, Gabby.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure I've been on SunoikisisDC before with a slightly smaller version of Nefertiti hanging out of my ear.
Okay, I think there are no more questions in the chat. I'm going to run just a last invitation for people to type their questions in the next minute or so, if they want. And okay, we got thank yous from people in the chat.
I guess in the meantime, a reminder that next week it's the final session in this semester, which is going to be on virtual reality and virtual environments. Presented by Juliette Quatre from the University of London and Lynn Verschuren from the University of Glasgow, which will be a super exciting session I've been looking forward to all semester.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our speakers for the session. Tom and Alicia, thank you. Thanks everybody who followed the session live, and if you've been following on YouTube, thank you very much as well. Reminder to do the exercise particularly if you are among the students who are required to do it. And we will see you all next week with the last session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.